The small town of El Cielo, tucked away in the arid heart of New Mexico, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, routines, and deepest secrets, until they pretended not to. It was a town of quiet streets, sun-bleached, buildings and a single main road lined with a few struggling businesses. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the heat pressed down on everything like an unspoken truth. It was the kind of place where outsiders rarely stayed for long, and those who did often had reasons they would rather not share. One of the few businesses that remained open despite the town's slow decay was Rivera's General Store, a small, dimly lit shop on the corner of Main and 2nd Street. It had been in business for decades, run by a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the worn wooden counter he stood behind. Alejandro Rivera was a quiet figure, built broad and sturdy, with dark, unreadable eyes that seemed to take in everything without offering anything in return. His face bore the weight of a man who had seen too much, though no one ever asked what those things were. People came to the store for supplies, sometimes for conversation, but never for answers. One late afternoon, a woman walked in with her young son, a boy no older than 5, his small hand gripping hers as he gazed curiously at the world around him. His name was Daniel, a child with bright, searching eyes and a mind that had not yet learned what should and should not be said. His mother, Sophia Carter, had moved to El Cielo only a few months ago, taking up a teaching job at the local elementary school. She was still adjusting to the way the town operated, how people spoke in half sentences and lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. There was a quietness in the air that was different from peace. It was something else, something heavier. Sophia walked through the narrow aisles, picking up a few necessities, while Daniel trailed beside her, his little fingers brushing over the cans and jars that lined the shelves. She was aware of the eyes that followed her, of the cautious way the other customers glanced at her before quickly looking away. It was not hostility, not exactly, but something close to it. A kind of guarded wariness, as if she might ask the wrong question at any moment. She had felt it before, in the way her landlord had hesitated before handing her the lease, in the way her students sometimes looked past her when she spoke, as if afraid of drawing attention to themselves. She approached the counter, setting her items down. Alejandro stood there, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He had been nothing but polite in the past, but his politeness was distant, detached, like a man accustomed to keeping people at arm's length. She had never seen him smile. Just as she reached for her wallet, Daniel, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly lifted his small hand and pointed directly at Alejandro. His voice was clear, his tone innocent, but certain. Cartel. The word landed like a gunshot in the silent store. For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to tighten, the room shrinking around them. Alejandro did not blink, did not react. But Sophia saw the slight shift in his posture, the way his fingers stilled against the wooden counter. The other customers, once casually browsing, had gone completely still. A woman near the door sucked in a sharp breath, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her purse. An elderly man near the canned goods turned his head just slightly, pretending to focus on a jar he had no intention of buying. The cashier, a young woman with nervous eyes, suddenly found a reason to leave, disappearing through the back door without a word. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her, pressing against her son. The silence was suffocating. Her pulse pounded as she knelt down, gripping Daniel's small shoulders. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" But Daniel only blinked at her, his small face puzzled, as if he did not understand why everyone had stopped moving. He had simply said a word that, in his mind, meant nothing more than any other. Sophia turned back to Alejandro, searching for some sign of what she should do, what she should say to fix this, but his face was unreadable, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost too quiet. "You should take your son home, Miss Carter." It was not a threat, not exactly, but there was something in the way he said it, something in the way the entire store held its breath that made Sophia's blood run cold. She did not argue. She did not ask questions. She simply grabbed Daniel's hand and turned, walking as quickly as she could without running. As they stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, the door swinging shut behind them, she realized her hands were shaking. She glanced down at Daniel, who looked up at her with innocent confusion. "Did I do something bad, Mommy?" Sophia forced a smile, but her stomach twisted painfully. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "You did nothing wrong." But as they crossed the street, she could feel it, that weight, that presence, like something unseen watching them from the dark corners of the town. Inside the store, Alejandro remained where he was, unmoving, his face as still as stone. And yet something had shifted. Somewhere someone had heard, and soon someone would come looking. Sophia's grip on Daniel's and remained firm as she walked him back to their small rental house on the outskirts of town. The sun was starting to set, stretching long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air was still, the kind of eerie stillness that made her hyper-aware of every sound. The crunch of gravel beneath her shoes, the faint rustling of dry grass, the distant hum of a car engine, idling longer than necessary. She tried to shake the feeling creeping up her spine, but it lingered, wrapping around her like an invisible force. It was irrational. It had to be. And yet the moment Daniel had uttered that word in the store, everything had changed. Back inside their home, she locked the door behind them, pressing her forehead against the wooden frame for a moment, gathering herself. She could feel Daniel looking up at her. She turned, forcing her voice to stay light. "How about you help me set the table, buddy?" Daniel grinned and ran to the kitchen, already forgetting the moment in the store. But Sophia couldn't. She had spent the past few months in El Cielo, trying to understand the town's quiet unease, but it had never been this tangible. She moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to glance out. The street was empty. But something felt off. Her mind drifted back to the decision that had brought her here in the first place. Before El Cielo, before she had uprooted their lives and moved to this small, peculiar town, she had been living in Denver. She had a comfortable, if not extraordinary, life, teaching at a school she loved, surrounded by colleagues who felt more like friends. But then came the divorce, the late-night arguments that turned into cold silences, the sleepless nights spent wondering if she had made the right choice. And then, of course, the court hearings. Her ex-husband, Mark, had fought for custody, not because he truly wanted to be a father, but because he wanted to win. He always wanted to win. He was powerful, well-connected, and relentless. And while she had ultimately won primary custody, the battle had drained her financially and emotionally. She needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the suffocating weight of her old life. El Cielo had seemed perfect. A small town with an open teaching position, a place where she and Daniel could start over, a place where no one knew their past. But now, staring out at the empty street, she wasn't sure she had made the right choice. The next morning, she dropped Daniel off at school, lingering a little longer than usual. The principal, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Delgado, noticed everything. "All right, Miss Carter?" Her voice was warm, but there was something behind her eyes, something knowing. Sophia hesitated. "Yes, just a long night." Mrs. Delgado nodded, as if she understood more than Sophia was saying. She gestured toward the hallway where students bustled to their classrooms. "You know, it takes time to feel at home in a town like this," she said gently. People don't open up easily, but that doesn't mean they aren't watching out. And for you, there was something in the way she said it that made Sophia's breath hitch, watching out for you, or watching her. Sophia forced a smile and thanked her before heading to her own classroom. But the unease lingered. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the small faculty lounge, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You look like someone who's got something on their mind." She looked up to see Ethan Blake, the town's sheriff, leaning against the doorway. He was a man in his early 40s, rugged in a way that suggested he had spent years chasing things that most people ran from. His uniform was crisp, his presence steady. She had only spoken to him a handful of times, mostly in passing, but she had noticed the way he paid attention, how his eyes scanned a room, how he listened more than he spoke. Sophia hesitated. If she told him what had happened in the store, would it make things worse? "I guess I'm still adjusting," she said carefully. Ethan stepped inside, grabbing a cup of coffee for himself. "El Cielo's not the easiest place to settle into," he admitted. "People here have long memories, and they don't forget things easily." That much she had already figured out. Ethan studied her for a moment before setting his cup down. "If something's bothering you, you can come to me." Sophia held his gaze. Would it make a difference? For the first time, something unreadable flickered across his face. "That depends on what you're asking." She considered pressing further, but before she could respond, the school bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Ethan gave her a nod before walking out, leaving her with more questions than answers. That evening, she decided to take Daniel for a walk through town. She wanted to prove to herself that she was being paranoid, that the tension she felt was just the result of being an outsider in a tight-knit community. As they walked past the general store, she noticed Alejandro standing outside, speaking in low tones with another man. The stranger was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket and sunglasses despite the setting sun. Something about him made Sophia's stomach twist. As if sensing her gaze, Alejandro looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, she thought she saw something, and there, a flicker of something deeper. But then he turned away, continuing his conversation as if she didn't exist. She and Daniel kept walking. As they neared their house, Daniel suddenly tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered. "That man." She followed his gaze to a parked car down the street, a dark sedan, its windows tinted. It had not been there before. Sophia felt her heartbeat spike. She did not stop walking, did not slow her pace. Once inside, she locked the door. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it had already started. The night stretched long and uneasy. Sophia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the image of the dark sedan parked outside. She had seen the shape of someone behind the wheel, though the tinted windows had obscured their face. Even after she had locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and turned off all the lights, she could still feel the weight of unseen eyes. She had moved to El Cielo for a fresh start, but now it felt like she had walked into something much worse than what she had left behind. Daniel shifted beside her, his small body warm against hers. She stroked his soft hair, pressing a kiss to his forehead. He had fallen asleep quickly, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. He was the reason she had to keep it together. He was the reason she could not afford to break. Somewhere outside, an engine roared to life. She tensed, listening as it rumbled down the street, fading into the distance. The car was gone. For now. The next morning, Sophia dropped Daniel off at school, lingering for a few extra minutes just to be sure no unfamiliar cars were lurking nearby. She was on edge, scanning every shadow, every face that held onto her gaze for a second. Too long. It was suffocating. She had to do something. Her first instinct was to go to Sheriff Ethan Blake, but something in his careful words yesterday made her hesitate. That quiet, measured way he had said, That depends on what you're asking. He had not outright dismissed her, but he had not given her reassurance either. Maybe he knew more than he was willing to admit. Instead, she decided to go back to the store. If anyone had answers, it was Alejandro Rivera. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The store was quiet, save for the soft hum of an old ceiling fan pushing warm air around. Alejandro was behind the counter, as he always was. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You came back," he said. Sophia crossed her arms, trying to steady her voice. "I need to talk to you." Alejandro didn't blink. "Then talk." She hesitated. There was something about him, something guarded, something that made her feel like she was stepping onto dangerous ground. But she had come this far. "The car," she said. "The one outside my house last night. Who was it?" Alejandro exhaled. Slowly, his fingers tapping against the counter. He didn't look surprised. That was enough to confirm he already knew. "I told you to take your son home," he said quietly. Sophia's stomach twisted. "That's not an answer." Alejandro studied her for a moment before stepping out from behind the counter. He walked toward the front of the store, flipping the open sign to closed, then turned the lock. Sophia's pulse kicked up. "What are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Alejandro leaned against the door, arms crossed. "Making sure we're not interrupted." The air between them grew thick. "You don't belong here, Ms. Carter," Alejandro said after a long pause. His tone wasn't threatening. If anything, it almost sounded like a warning. "This town, this place, it has rules." Sophia clenched her fists. "I came here to build a life for my son, not to live in fear." Alejandro's jaw tensed. "Then you picked the wrong town." Her breath hitched. "I don't know who you think I am," she said carefully, "but I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, something flickered across Alejandro's face, something like regret. "You should," he said, "before it's too late." The rest of the day crawled by. Sophia went to work, tried to focus on her students, but she couldn't shake Alejandro's words. Before it's too late. It wasn't just a warning, it was a certainty. At pickup, she spotted Sheriff Blake standing near his cruiser, watching the schoolyard. She caught his gaze, debating whether to approach him. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her stomach drop, a man in a dark leather jacket. The same one who'd been speaking to Alejandro outside the store yesterday, standing near the school fence. He wasn't watching the other kids. He was watching Daniel. Sophia moved before she could think. She reached Daniel and scooped him up in her arms, barely glancing at the other parents around her. The man smirked, as if amused by her reaction. Then he turned and walked away. That night, after putting Daniel to bed, Sophia sat in her living room, clutching a photo in her hands. It was an old one, her and her father, sitting by the lake near their old home in Colorado. She was barely 10 in the picture, grinning with a fishing rod in her hands. Her father, a former military man, had been the one who taught her how to stand her ground. "Never show fear, Sophia," he used to say. "Fear is an invitation. If they sense it, they'll take more than you're willing to give." She had taken his words with her into adulthood, through the battles with Mark, through the nights she had cried in secret, wondering if she was making the right choices. And now, in this town where secrets whispered through the walls, she needed to remember that more than ever. She would not be afraid. The next morning, she drove to the sheriff's office. Ethan Blake was at his desk, flipping through paperwork. He looked up when she entered, setting his pen down. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said. Sophia didn't sit. "I need answers." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "That depends on what you're asking." Her patience snapped. "My son is being watched," she said. "There was a car outside my house last night, and Alejandro Rivera told me I should leave town. You think I don't see what's happening?" Ethan sighed. rubbing his temple. El cielo is complicated. That's not an answer. He hesitated. Then finally he leaned forward. The man you saw by the school, he said. His name is Mateo Salazar. He's not just some drifter. He works for people who don't like outsiders asking questions. Sophia swallowed. Cartel. Ethan's eyes darkened. Officially. There's no cartel presence here. Unofficially. This town has been in their pocket for years. Sophia's blood ran cold. You need to be careful, Ethan continued. People, like Salazar, they don't make threats. They make promises. Sophia's hands curled into fists. And Alejandro? She asked. Ethan's expression hardened. He's in deeper than you think. That night, Sophia barely slept. Every noise outside made her heart pound. Every shadow felt like it was moving. At 2:37 a.m., her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. There was no text, just a single photo of Daniel at school, taken from a distance. Her stomach clenched. Then another message came through. Leave. Her hands trembled. This was not a warning anymore. It was a promise. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, staring at the picture of Daniel on the screen. The message, leave, burned into her mind like a brand, an unspoken threat that sent ice through her veins. Someone had taken that photo. Someone had been watching him, close enough to capture the image, but far enough to remain unseen. She bolted out of bed, rushing to Daniel's room. He was still asleep, curled up with his stuffed dinosaur, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a brief moment, the sight of him safe and unaware gave her the illusion of control. But she wasn't in control. She grabbed her phone, snapped a screenshot of the message, and forwarded it to Ethan Blake with a single text. We need to talk, now. A response came almost immediately. Stay put. I'm coming. Sophia exhaled shakily, backing away from Daniel's bed, her mind racing. She checked the locks on every door, every window. It wasn't enough. Whoever had sent that message had already crossed the invisible boundary of fear. They weren't just watching. They were closing in. 15 minutes later, Ethan's cruiser pulled up outside. She saw the flash of his badge. Before opening the door, he stepped inside, eyes sharp, scanning the room like he expected an ambush. You okay? She shook her head. No. She handed him her phone. He looked at the messages, his expression darkening. Salazar, he muttered. Sophia's stomach clenched. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. They're pushing you, testing how far you'll go before you break. I'm not breaking, she whispered, but it felt like a lie. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Sophia, I need you to listen to me carefully. These people don't bluff. They don't send warnings unless they're prepared to follow through. Sophia crossed her arms. So what? I pack up, leave town, pretend this never happened. Ethan hesitated. If it means keeping your son safe, yes. She clenched her jaw. I can't. I won't let them push me out. Ethan exhaled, but there was something in his gaze, something almost resigned. Then you need to be ready for what comes next, he said. The next morning, she kept Daniel home from school. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, like a storm gathering just over the horizon. At noon, a knock sounded at her door. Not Ethan. Alejandro Rivera. Sophia hesitated before opening it. Alejandro stepped inside without being invited, his face unreadable as always. You should have left already, he said. Sophia's pulse pounded. You keep saying that, but you're not giving me a reason. Alejandro stared at her for a long moment before speaking. I was like you once, he said, voice low. Thought I could fight my way out. Thought I could stand against them. Sophia frowned. And? Alejandro's jaw tensed. And I learned the hard way that there are some fights you don't win. A chill crawled up her spine. "Why are you here?" she asked. Alejandro's dark eyes flickered toward the hallway where Daniel's toys lay scattered on the floor. "They'll take him," he said. "If you stay." Sophia's breath caught. "You're lying," she whispered. But deep down she wasn't sure. Alejandro exhaled, looking suddenly tired. "You think I want this?" he asked. "You think I want to watch another mother lose her son?" Sophia swallowed hard. "Then help me." Alejandro studied her, something warring behind his expression. Then finally he spoke. "There's only one way out of this," he said. Sophia waited, heart pounding. "You need to make them think you're dead." Night fell, and Sophia sat in the darkened living room, trying to process what Alejandro had told her. Fake her death, disappear. It sounded insane. But was it any crazier than staying here, waiting for Salazar and his people to make good on their threats? The alternative was worse. She pulled Daniel onto her lap, stroking his hair. He was all she had. She would not let them take him. Her phone buzzed. Another message. No text, just a video. Her stomach turned as she clicked it. The screen flickered. Shot of her house, taken from outside, from you right now. Sophia's blood ran cold. She bolted upright, yanking Daniel into her arms. The phone buzzed again. "Time's up." Her breath hitched. Then, a loud bang! Outside, a car door slamming, footsteps coming. Closer, Sophia's mind raced. Nowhere to run. No time. She grabbed the baseball bat by the door, positioning herself between Daniel and the entrance. Another bang. Louder this time. Then a voice. Low. Menacing. "Come out, Miss Carter. Let's talk." "Salazar," Daniel whimpered. Sophia held him tight. She had one chance, one move. Her heart thundered. Then suddenly, a gunshot. From outside, a sharp yell of pain. Then silence. Sophia's breath hitched. Footsteps, running. Someone retreating. Then a knock at the door. Ethan's voice. "Sophia, it's me. Open up." She barely managed to unlock it before collapsing against him. Daniel clutched in her arms. Ethan steadied her, gun drawn. "He's gone for now, but he'll be back." Sophia looked up at him, panic rising. "What do we do?" Ethan's eyes were grim. "We finish this." Then a car screeched to a stop outside, and Alejandro stepped out, gun in hand. "It's time," he said. Sophia had no choice. The world outside seemed frozen in a moment of unbearable tension. The glow of headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating Alejandro's silhouette as he stepped toward the house, gun in hand. Behind him, Ethan kept his weapon drawn, eyes scanning the street for movement. Sophia clutched Daniel tightly, her heart hammering in her chest. This was it, whatever Alejandro meant by "it's time." It was happening now. A distant car engine rumbled, a low growl of a predator preparing to pounce. Then, a second gunshot. The street exploded into chaos. Ethan shoved Sophia and Daniel behind him, his stance shifting as he aimed into the darkness. Alejandro moved fast, pressing himself against the house, his gaze locked on the same unseen threat. A figure emerged from the shadows. Mateo Salazar. Dressed in the same leather jacket, but this time he wasn't alone. Two other men followed closely, their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across their faces. Salazar smirked. "You really should have listened, Miss Carter." Sophia felt her breath hitch. Alejandro stepped forward. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something lethal just beneath the surface. "She's under my protection." Salazar chuckled. "Your protection? That's funny, considering where your loyalties lie." Ethan tensed beside him, and for the first time, Sophia caught something in his face. Hesitation. Doubt. She turned to Alejandro. realization dawning. What is he talking about? Alejandro's jaw clenched. For a moment he didn't answer. Then, "Tell her," Salazar taunted. "Tell her the truth, Rivera." Sofia's pulse pounded. Alejandro exhaled, lowering his weapon just slightly. His eyes met hers, dark and filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I used to work for them," he admitted. Sofia's stomach twisted. Salazar's grin widened. "Not just work for us," he said. "He was one of our best. Smuggling, cleaning up loose ends. You name it." Sofia felt sick. Alejandro, this man who had warned her, who had told her to run, had been one of them. "I got out," Alejandro said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "I walked away, and you know it," Salazar scoffed. "Nobody walks away, Alejandro." A beat of silence, then Salazar took a step closer, tilting his head. His next words sent ice through Sofia's veins. "You think she knows everything, don't you?" Salazar said, his gaze shifting to her. "You think she knows why she's really in this town?" Sofia stiffened. "What?" Salazar smirked. "Savoring the moment? You think it was random? That you just happened to land in a town controlled by the cartel?" He let out a dry laugh. "You're not here by accident, Miss Carter." Her blood ran cold. Salazar's voice dropped to something, almost amused. "Tell her, Alejandro. Tell her who her ex-husband really is." Sofia's breath caught. She turned to Alejandro, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is he talking about?" Alejandro hesitated. Too long. Sofia's hands shook. No, it couldn't be. "You already know, don't you?" Salazar said. "You just don't want to believe it." A memory slammed into her. Mark, her ex-husband, the cold way he had looked at her during their divorce hearings, the way he had always been untouchable, the money, the connections, the way he had tried to take Daniel, not out of love, but out of control. Sofia's stomach twisted as the pieces clicked together. Her ex-husband had ties to the cartel, and she had been running right into their territory without even knowing it. Sofia stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking across her skin. "No, that's the truth," Salazar finished for her. Ethan moved closer to her side, his voice urgent. "Sofia, we need to get out of here. Now." But Salazar wasn't done. "Here's the thing," he said, rubbing his chin. "We were going to let you go. You were an inconvenience, and sure, but nothing we couldn't handle until—" His eyes flicked toward Daniel. "Until your son opened his mouth." Sofia's heart clenched. "He said cartel in front of the wrong people," Salazar continued. "And that's not something we can just ignore." Sofia's hands tightened into fists. "You leave," Salazar said, "and maybe we forget about you. Maybe." Sofia swallowed hard, her mind racing. If she left, they would never stop watching. Daniel would never be safe. Unless her gaze shifted to Alejandro. He was their weak spot. He had just walked away. He had just history. And something told her he was hiding something bigger. Sofia squared her shoulders, forcing her fear down. "You don't want me," she said, her voice steady. "You want him," Salazar chuckled. "Oh, we already have plans for him." Sofia turned to Alejandro, meeting his gaze. "Give them something bigger," she said. Alejandro didn't blink, but something in his face changed. Salazar narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Alejandro exhaled. Then, slowly, he pulled something. From his pocket, a flash drive. Salazar's expression shifted. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "I wasn't just working for you," Alejandro said. "I was recording everything." The air between them thickened. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Alejandro, I have names," Alejandro continued, his voice deadly calm. "Accounts, transfers, everything." Salazar's smirk disappeared. "You're bluffing." Alejandro tossed the drive to Ethan. "Find out." Silence. Then Salazar lunged. A gunshot rang out. Salazar, Nietzsche, collapsed. To the ground, clutching his leg. Ethan still had his weapon raised, his face unreadable. One of Salazar's men pulled his gun. Alejandro moved first, taking him down with a single shot. The third man ran. Ethan let him. For a moment, everything was still. Then the weight of what had just happened crashed into Sofia like a tidal wave. Alejandro knelt beside Salazar, gripping the front of his jacket. "You're done," he said, his voice low. Salazar winced, blood pooling beneath him. "You think this ends it?" Alejandro's expression was cold. "I know it does." He stood, turning to Ethan. "You have what you need?" Ethan looked at the drive in his hand. "If this is real," Ethan said, "it's enough to burn them all." Sofia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. Almost. She looked at Alejandro. "What happens now?" she asked. Alejandro met her gaze. "You disappear," he said. Sofia's chest tightened. She knew he was right. She turned to Daniel, who had been silent, watching everything with wide eyes. She crouched beside him, brushing his hair back. "We're going on a trip," she whispered. Daniel nodded, trusting her completely. As Ethan called in backup, as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Sofia knew. This was the end of one life, and the start of another. The desert air was crisp. In the early morning light, Sofia stood by the window of a small, nondescript motel room on the outskirts of Phoenix, watching the world stir to life. The weight in her chest hadn't fully lifted, but it was lighter than it had been in weeks. Daniel was still asleep, curled. Up beneath the thin sheets, his stuffed dinosaur clutched tightly in his small hands. He was safe. That was the only thing that mattered now. Ethan had driven them out of El Cielo under the cover of night, stopping at a small, quiet town far. Enough from the cartel's reach, at least for now. Alejandro had gone a separate way, disappearing into the darkness, with the promise that he would handle things on his end. Sofia hadn't asked what that meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She moved carefully, heart hammering for just a second before she heard Ethan's voice. "It's me," she exhaled, unlocking the door. Ethan stepped inside, looking just as exhausted as she felt. He tossed a newspaper onto the table. Before taking a seat in the worn motel chair, Sofia glanced at the headline. "Cartel ties exposed in small town. High-ranking officials under investigation." Her stomach flipped as she read further. The evidence Alejandro had handed over, bank transfers, hidden surveillance tapes, records of bribes, had made its way into the hands of the FBI. Several powerful figures, including businessmen, law enforcement officials, and government contacts linked to the cartel, were already being taken in for questioning. And Mateo Salazar? He had disappeared. The report said he had been transported to a hospital for emergency care after his gunshot wound. But by the time the authorities arrived for questioning, he was gone. Sofia's grip tightened on the newspaper. Ethan caught her expression. "They won't find him, not for a long time at least." Sofia swallowed hard. "And if they do," Ethan shrugged. "By then, he won't have a network to fall back on. The cartel's been dealt a big enough blow that it's going to take them years to rebuild." It wasn't the kind of reassurance she wanted, but it was something. Sofia sat down across from him, rubbing her temples. "So what now?" she asked. Ethan exhaled. "We keep you off the grid for a while. I've arranged for new IDs. A new life. You'll have to be careful, but—" He glanced at Daniel. "It's a second chance." Sofia looked at her son, the slow rise and fall of his breath steady and peaceful. A second chance. She had spent so much time running, so much time fighting battles she hadn't even known she was part of. And now, she could finally choose what came next. But there was still one thing left unanswered. "Alejandro," she said quietly. "Where is he?" Ethan hesitated. then shook his head. "No one knows," he admitted. After he handed over the evidence, he vanished. Sophia stared down at the newspaper, her mind racing. She had no doubt that Alejandro had his own plan. Whether that meant running, seeking revenge, or disappearing for good, she didn't know. But she owed him her life, and if he ever came back, she would be ready. 3 months later. The wind rolled through the Colorado mountains, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Sophia sat on the porch of a small, cozy cabin, sipping a cup of coffee. The view stretched for miles, mountains in the distance, a narrow river winding through the valley below. It was nothing like El Cielo, and that was exactly what she had wanted. Daniel was inside, drawing at the kitchen table, his laughter occasionally. Breaking the peaceful quiet of the morning, he was adjusting well. He had made new friends at the local school, started talking about soccer, dinosaurs, and silly jokes again. The nightmares had faded. For the first time in a long time, he was just a kid again. And Sophia, she was still learning what it meant to breathe, to exist without looking over her shoulder, to start over. Her new name felt foreign on her tongue, Emma Wells, a carefully crafted identity that gave her the chance to rebuild. It was strange, being someone else. But in some ways, it was freeing. No more Mark, no more CARTEL, no more running. As she stared out at the mountains, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that this could be home. Then, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel made her freeze. She turned sharply, heart hammering. A lone figure stood at the edge of the driveway, dressed in worn jeans and a dark jacket, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. Alejandro. Sophia's breath caught. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. "You made it," he said quietly. Sophia swallowed hard. "So did you." A faint, tired smile ghosted across his lips. "I had to be sure you were safe," he admitted. Her chest tightened. "Are you?" he asked. She exhaled. "For now." Alejandro nodded as if that answer was enough. But she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here just for small talk. He had unfinished business. Sophia hesitated, then asked the question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. "What happens now?" Alejandro glanced toward the cabin, where Daniel's laughter rang out. Then he met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I take care of the loose ends," he said. Sophia's stomach twisted. And after that, for the first time, something flickered in his face, a hesitation. "After that," he said, voice quieter, "we see what's left." She didn't know what that meant, but something told her she wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare her. She held his gaze. "Be careful, Alejandro." He gave a small, knowing nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the road. Sophia exhaled, feeling something shift inside her. This wasn't the end, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a beginning. The mountains stretched endlessly in front of her, their peaks dusted with early snow, standing as silent witnesses to everything she had endured. Sophia sat on the cabin's porch, her fingers curled around a cup of coffee, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear, the uncertainty, the battle for survival, was beginning to fade. Daniel's laughter spilled from inside the cabin as he played, his voice bright and unburdened. He was adjusting. He was safe. That was all that mattered. And yet she couldn't ignore the part of her that still looked over her shoulder, still expected the past to reach out and pull her back into its grip. The visit from Alejandro 3 weeks ago had stirred something in her. He had left without saying where he was going, but she knew he was tying up loose ends. Whatever that meant, Whatever he had to do, she hadn't stopped him, because she trusted him. It was strange, realizing that. The man who had once been part of the world that tried to destroy her was now the only person she felt truly understood what she had been through. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart clenched instinctively, but when she opened it, Ethan stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Sophia nodded, stepping aside. Daniel was still playing in the other room, humming to himself, oblivious to the tension that filled the air. Ethan glanced around, taking in the cozy, quiet space. "You're settling in?" Sophia folded her arms, trying to. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wanted to give you an update. Salazar's still missing. His men scattered. The cartel's been destabilized, but—" He hesitated. "But they're not gone." Sophia finished for him. Ethan nodded. "There's always someone waiting to take the throne, but it won't be the same. Not with the kind of evidence Alejandro handed over." Sophia exhaled. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. She had spent so much of her life trying to escape the ghosts of the past. Maybe they would always linger, but at least now they no longer had power over her. Ethan studied her for a moment. "You really aren't the same woman who showed up in El Cielo, are you?" Sophia gave a small, knowing smile. "No, I'm not." She had been afraid. She had been running. She had felt powerless. Now she had taken control of her own story. Ethan shifted. "And Alejandro?" Sophia's chest tightened. "I don't know." Ethan nodded as if that answer didn't surprise him. "If he reaches out, let me know." Sophia arched a brow. "So you can arrest him?" Ethan smirked slightly. "So I can make sure he's not getting himself killed?" Sophia let out a breath of amusement. "I'll think about it." Ethan gave her a long look, then stood. "Take care of yourself." "Sophia." She met his gaze. "You too." As he left, she watched his car disappear down the mountain road, leaving her in the quiet. She turned back toward the cabin, where Daniel was still playing, lost in his own world, her world. 1 year later, air was warmer now, summer settling into the valley. Sophia stood at the edge of the lake near their new home, watching Daniel skip stones across the water. So much had changed. She had built something here, a life, a sense of normalcy. She had taken a job at a local bookstore, something simple, something that allowed her to be home every afternoon when Daniel got back from school. She had learned to laugh again, to breathe, to wake up without fear. She had even made friends. Real ones, people who didn't whisper in hushed tones or watch her with guarded eyes, and yet some part of her still waited for the past to knock on her door, waited for Alejandro. She had not seen him since the night he walked away. No messages, no warnings, nothing. Maybe that was for the best, maybe not. Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, did you see that one? It skipped 5 times. She smiled, ruffling his hair. "You're getting better." Daniel beamed before running off to try again. Sophia exhaled, turning her gaze back to the lake. Then a shift in the air, a presence behind her. She didn't flinch, didn't tense. She knew who it was before she even turned around. "Alejandro," she murmured. He stood just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking as unreadable as ever. "You're hard to find," he said. She smirked. That was the idea. Alejandro's gaze flickered to Daniel, who was still lost in his game. "He's happy," he said. Sophia nodded. "He is." A beat of silence. Then she asked the question she had been holding in for a year. "Are you?" Alejandro hesitated, his dark eyes searching hers. Then finally, he exhaled. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer she expected, but it was honest. He had spent his life in a world that didn't allow people to just walk away. And yet somehow he had done it. But at what cost? Sophia took a step closer, lowering her voice. What happens now? Alejandro smirked faintly. That's up to you. The words sent a quiet thrill through her. For so long her life had been dictated by fear, by people who wanted to control her fate. But now, she had a choice. She held his gaze. You can stay, she said. Alejandro's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. He glanced at Daniel, then back at her. Are you sure? Sophia smiled. Yes. For the first time, Alejandro looked almost relieved. He gave a small nod, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. And just like that, something shifted between them. A new beginning, a new life, one they could choose. And for the first time, Sophia knew she wasn't running anymore. She was home.